The user ContraPoints, hereafter referred to as Nick, made a video response to me in which he completely misrepresents my views on the basis of his own faulty inference. I actually would like to apologize to any Marxist, Freudian, or feminist film critics I might have hit in the crossfire trying to thin their ranks of bad attempts at criticism. For the record, I have nothing against Marxist, Freudian, or feminist film analysis, except for when it is done poorly. These thought systems simply deserve a better class of critic. Also, for the record, I never said that I exclusively held the Joseph Campbell's point of view. In fact, what I said was, Joseph Campbell, Hero with a Thousand Faces, not that I would say that you should, read this and dogmatize, Campbell's point of view. My reasons for mentioning Joseph Campbell and the Hero with a Thousand Faces were threefold. One, I did it to counter the notion that the meaning or metaphor of a movie is always local and narrowly political. I think that we have a lot more in common than our ancestors than we generally think, even if we do live in a world which they would scarcely be able to recognize, technologically speaking. Number two, I did it to offer an alternative to the points of view put forward by Nick. Number three, although I did not state it explicitly in my last video, The Hero with a Thousand Faces has become something of mandatory reading for any would-be American filmmaker since George Lucas used it as his Bible to make the original Star Wars. Therefore, its influence on American cinema is noteworthy.
I would be quite interested to have an argument over whether feminism and Marxism are legitimate sort of literary theories vis-a-vis Joseph Campbell monomyth universalist type structuralism. I think that's an interesting debate to be had, but Tooltime's not interested in having it because he thinks that Joseph Campbell is common sense, or he thinks that Joseph Campbell is right inherently, or right without explanation, or is in some way not an academic theory that is being imposed on the text.
Since Nick assumes that these points of view are in opposition because Joseph Campbell is a structuralist, I should point out that this isn't necessarily the case. Let's look at these one by one. Marxism. Joseph Campbell's own view of the function of mythology is fairly congruent with ContraPoint's explanation of Marxist film theory. He simply would not have put it in the same terms. Freudianism. Joseph Campbell was a Jungian and was personal friends with Jung. This should give you some idea of the differences of their point of view. Joseph Campbell was well aware of the works of Freud. Feminism. Joseph Campbell taught at Sarah Lawrence College back when it was an all-women's college. Campbell was well aware of the fact that, historically speaking, nearly all hero stories have been boy stories. He would not, however, have held that is the way that it should be, so it is hard to imagine that him being opposed to feminist film criticism. He taught classrooms full of women for decades. I'm sure he got plenty of the female point of view on stories. I also want to say that perhaps my use of the word bias is misplaced, and perhaps the word I'm looking for is prejudice. Nick describes Marxist theory as if it were a foregone conclusion machine. Input any movie and the output will be that it is ruling class propaganda. This is a poor explanation of Marxism, and Nick only compounds the problem by not taking the time to try and carefully apply it to the movie he's talking about. Nick's attempts to link the movie The Avengers to the military-industrial complex and American foreign policy were sloppy and unresearched at best.
The first thing I'd like to say in my defense is that really I have a didactic aim in mind when I speak that sentence. That is, I'm trying to use The Avengers as a means of teaching people what it's like to do a Marxist analysis of a text, of a movie, or what it's like to do a Freudian or a feminist analysis. That's why I'm stating my theoretical presuppositions so blatantly. I'm trying to teach Marx, I'm trying to teach Freud to my audience, for whom I think Marx and Freud are still fairly exotic. And the reason I state my claim, I state so explicitly what it means to do a Marxist or a Freudian critique, is that I think many of the people watching my videos just aren't familiar with Marx and Freud, and so they need to have it explained and so that they know what I'm doing. And I guess one of the reasons I do that is because I'm trying to sort of educate. I try to educate while I do the other things that I do on YouTube, because I know that a lot of people don't have the same academic background that I do, and so I need to explain what I'm doing, otherwise I'm just going to be completely irrelevant to most people.
Nick, I feel I should try and dissuade you from doing what you're trying to do. First, you're not very good at it, and nor are you qualified. Second, rather than attempt to explain everything yourself, you could instead be a conduit of information or a reaggregator of information on the subject that you want to get your audience interested in, and simply direct them to something publicly available which already contains the information you're trying to convey in a form which at best, you would have to put a considerable amount of your own time into reconstructing something on par. Or to put it another way, there's lots of better information about Marxism on the internet, and if you really wanted your audience to learn about it, you could just simply point them to that. Particularly in regards to Marx and Freud, I think you should give second thought to the idea that these are esoteric to your audience. Looking at my own audience analytics, I can tell you that the vast majority of my audience is 25 or older. Perhaps there are high school students who have not heard of Marx or Freud, but your audience may in fact be better educated than you think. Given that the largest part of my audience is of an older demographic, I think it would be insulting to their intelligence if I explained Marx and Freud to them. Perhaps your audience is substantially different. If you were attempting to explain an actually obscure thinker like Christopher or Deleuze, then I might see your point. But Marx and Freud are thinkers that pretty much anyone who's made it through freshman year of college, or anyone with a modicum of intellectual curiosity have already discovered.
What this raises is, I think, a really interesting point about what it means for a work of art to mean something. Where does the meaning come from? And Tooltime seems to think that it comes from the author, from the production process, and from some universal structure of mythology which is present in all of these works. And he seems to think that anyone who disagrees with him is not just someone who subscribes to a different theory than his own theory, but someone who is confused, someone who is poorly researched, who doesn't bother to find out what the author of the work thinks.
To be clear here, Nick is making sweeping claims about my point of view on the basis of inference. The reason I mention the importance of research is because it's important. Cultures and the domains of meaning therein are not static and monolithic, they are dynamic. Understanding who made it, how, and why helps inform us as to where on the cultural landscape it fits. Nick describes the heroes of the Avengers as one-dimensional video game avatars, apparently because of their lack of character development and exploration in that movie. He ignores completely that several of these characters, namely Iron Man, the Hulk, Captain America, and Thor, had their own movies prior to the Avengers. More than that, each of these characters have decades of character development through comic book, and the people making the Avengers probably assumed that the Avengers audience members would have a fair amount of background knowledge going into the movie. Not knowing, or at least not acknowledging this, makes Nick's statements seem ignorant and misplaced.
The way we think about art, I'm not sure. I don't think it makes sense to talk about the inherent meaning of a thing. Meaning, interpretation is something that the reader brings to a work, and this is pretty much the standard view in literary criticism in the 20th century onwards. That meaning is basically something that the reader brings to the table. It's not inherent in the text itself, or the movie, as the case may be. And Tooltime doesn't seem to acknowledge this, whereas at least I'm honest about what I'm doing. I say, look, this is the theory that I'm applying. I explain what my theory is to my audience. And I explain how you could go about applying this theory to works, how you can look for these kinds of things.
To say that the reader is 100% responsible for the meaning of a text is absurd. The communication and meaning process is dynamic, and Nick is just trying to invoke some crap about death of the author and modern literary theory to obscure the fact that he doesn't actually know what he's talking about. To summarize, Nick's video was basically poorly formed and poorly delivered and amounts to some serious communication problems and bad teaching, if this is his attempt to teach. And I don't merely make this video to quote-unquote pwn him. Nick, I really do think that you should think a bit harder about your approach to trying to teach whatever it is you're trying to teach to the audience. Maybe, not quite underestimate your audience as much, and don't confuse the audience by talking about a movie and then without really clarifying, drifting into just talking about generalities or other movies in the genre without if you want to critique the Avengers, or if you want to use Marxism to critique a movie, do put more effort than 30 seconds into explaining something like Marxist theory, for one thing. And for another thing, perhaps you should examine the movie closely. That is why I said I liked the Amazing Atheist's Star Wars reviews, because he actually dealt with the source material. He actually talked about the movie and not just talked around the movie and about the generalities and the similarities that this movie has with other movies and how that may or may not be connected to the power structure of America or whatever. Your video was just bad. I'm sorry.